a dominant narrative developed that the war was about the LRA and their bizarre behavior and their abduction of children. In fact, the war began with government activity, with government abuses. The war continued with government abuses, both in policy and in action on the part of their troops. And in fact, one of the really striking things about the war is that far more people died because of conditions in the camps, because of the structural violence, than were ever killed by the rebels. Structural violence was quieter, but more deadly than the overt violence of the rebels. The huts in the displacement camps, if anyone has seen images or anyone was here, were so jammed together that sometimes the thatched roofs of huts touched one another. The camps were horrible places. People couldn't grow their own food mostly. They couldn't make a living in other ways. They were places of forced isolation because they were cut off from other camps, and forced crowding within the camps. People were caught between the overt violence of rebels, the overt violence of government troops, and the structural violence of the camps that they were forced to live in for years. In 1996, as the war was entering its second decade, the government decided to begin a policy of forced displacement. It was government policy in the western half, essentially, of Acholi land. And one of the reasons is that this was one of the main entry areas of the rebels who had their bases in South Sudan by this time. They would enter northern Uganda through what's western Acholi. And the government said that they were establishing these camps for protection in 1996. They were called euphemistically protected villages. They were not protected.
I'm standing now. We are viewing on my left-hand side. We are viewing former IDP camps of Pagak. It runs from where you see those grass-thatched houses, from there up to the mouth of that hill. Just next to the mouth of the hill is where the army barracks was. It also had a very big numbers of displaced persons, over 6,000 people. My parents were also displaced, and they were also in this same camp. They came in 1996 and then stayed to 2006, 2007. But my father was killed later on, some time back in 2005. He was an old man, but was pushed by the people when the rebel actually raided the camp, and they were trying, everybody could escape from the gunshot and the rest, and being an old man, he was pushed. Then later on, he died in the hospital. He was also buried there in the camp.
It's clear that the policy was more about military strategy, a typical anti-insurgency strategy of getting people off the land, people who could provide food, people who could provide intelligence, people who could provide cover for the rebels.
People were given 24 hours to go and stay in the internally displaced camp. And everybody started carrying things, leaving everything at home. People lost their animals, people lost their homes, houses were burned. In that case, many were killed during the process of moving down to the camps.
Remove them, put them into camps controlled by the government, and the rebels would have a more difficult time, and the government could pursue these rebels more easily. So little of this broader context is part of the dominant narrative of the war. Almost all the attention has focused on a few aspects of the rebels, aspects that are not inaccurate. The rebels did abduct. The rebels did do horrible things. But that only explains really a portion of the violence, the damage, the effects of this war on the people caught up in it in Acholi.
I'm born from this home in 1984, where I stayed for a period of 6 years. And then after, when I was 6 years old, the security of this place was not conducive. It was really very, very terrible for me to stay with my old parents. And then that being in place, a son to my uncle thought of giving an assistance to my parents by picking me so that it could relieve both of my mother and my father from looking after themselves in case when the rebel come, and at the same time also carrying me on their back, running with me, going to the bush, hiding. So he picked me. I went to Kampala. In 1996, all the people in this place, say in the Acholi sub-region, the idea of sending them to IDP camp came as the result of the rebel over disturbing, sometimes abducting the young children and the rest. So my parents were sent and they were displaced to Pagak IDP camps.
And so this policy of forced displacement actually then resulted for many Acholi people, displacement off their land, away from their homes, away from their ability to produce their own food for more than 10 years. One of the camps, the largest of the camps, was over 60,000 people. There's been no fighting there with respect to this war since the peace talks began.
The radio started coming into sensitize that you really need to go back home. It's time. There's relative peace. You need to go. There's nothing wrong. Go and start planning.
Tita wacha boka tita tita loki tita boka ba wacha rama koba ma wacha do tita loki nyaga we nyaga kel kuyu mukwalo ngwa wa jwa ke la ga mukalo chamo
bin ka do be loy kem ngo kem ni be ye ka tom pi be pe yen be pe man ko me gwa du kan no I ke ji yini ke ta I te ke re pi be ke
Yeah, in the case there are a lot of one
ya nu wel wir in ne ma pierre 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 kan wo we kan be ki yo ye re mu
The conflict and the camps stretched and twisted and distorted Acholi culture and Acholi cultural and social bonds, but it didn't break them. It broke some, but not irreparably. Those bonds, those connections are being rebuilt in local communities, in local villages, in clans, in parts of clans all over Acholi.
These ladies contribute grass. Grass is usually used for touching up the roof for the house. Witnessing the use of the village, trying to build a house for their traditional chief. These youths are not paid any loan. They do their work voluntarily on free merit. The chiefs have come to play a great role in uniting the people together. So, our dear visitors, you are most welcome today. After the work, always, The women, they perform their traditional dance before their chief. That's a sign of appreciation and solidarity.
After years of displacement, returning to land that is primarily communal land, customary land, there are no records of where people were settled, what boundaries are. Many of the elders that knew these boundaries had died. Some of the boundary markers had been destroyed. It's not surprising that there have been disputes over land. And they're not resolved because NGOs go out and resolve them or international organizations. They're resolved because local people resolve them using local customary leadership or very local government officials. Most are resolved outside the court system. There have also been disputes because certain powerful people have grabbed land, sometimes literally thousands of hectares of land, and claimed it as empty land that they have a right to occupy and farm and own.
Now, I think what we see is an experiment in what has been called disaster capitalism. In order to push through changes, generally privatization, especially around land, commodification of land, and like a century ago, today's justification for taking this land is once again development.
If people can protect their communal land, and that's a big if, but if they can, there is a remarkable resource that's available for this rebuilding. More than in most parts of Uganda or most parts of Africa now, there is land that can allow for future population growth. There is land that can allow, if people can control and be secure in their land, that can be used for development while not threatening the people whose land this is. Land could be leased to companies. Land could be used for commercial purposes while not destroying the communal customary land tenure that exists and that I think is crucial. I think we're going to see some really exciting developments. Culture always changes. Acholi culture is changing, but it's still grounded in Acholi culture. That's my prognosis for the future.